Welcome to Two Lit Ladies podcast. The topic for today's podcast is adolescent brain and literacy development. The Two Lit Ladies, Dr. Katherine McKnight and Deanna Gallagher, are literacy educators who specialize in developing reading, writing, and literacy skills for all students. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Katherine McKnight here with Deanna Gallagher, the Two Lit Ladies. And our focus today for podcast number 2 is the adolescent brain, which of course we have to say like zombies, right? Like Walking Dead. So the adolescent brain and literacy development. So we really want to focus on the changes in the brain during adolescence and what it means. And whenever I present on this topic, especially in schools and with teachers, I would say, we've always known that teenagers lose their minds, but now we have the biological evidence to prove it. We have the evidence now that it's not so crazy. So there's significant changes that happen with the onset of puberty, what we're finding. And the changes in the brain are as dramatic in adolescence as they are in 0 to 12 months. And this is relatively new research. It's very important, especially in all things adolescent, but we're going to focus in on literacy development and how that impacts kids when they're getting into more complex texts in middle school and high school, even as young as 4th and 5th grade. So there's huge changes in the prefrontal cortex. Right behind your forehead, that's generally where your prefrontal cortex is. And there's a shift that happens with the onset of puberty. The brain starts shifting and creating connections that allow for more metaphorical reasoning and inferencing, moving from the literal to more abstract thinking. So one of the examples that I think of, Deanna, is as a high school English teacher back in the day, is when I would teach Shakespeare to 9th graders, and we would talk about, for instance, like Romeo's dream about Queen Mab, and it's actually metaphorical for he and his relationships, his romantic relationships, and my students would just look at me like, well, why is he talking about that? They couldn't understand that it was actually metaphorical. And then teaching Macbeth to juniors, they would totally get how dreams foretold and foreshadowed and were parallels to what the characters were thinking.
Well, I was just thinking when you talked about that shift to metaphoric thinking and how obvious it is to anyone who has ever taught middle school or who has a middle schooler. Particularly one of the comments that's most often made about people teaching English at that level is how literal-minded the average middle schooler is. And just actually, literal-mindedness actually makes it a perfect time to teach some very concrete rules about the way that language works. And it also is a great time to start building the foundation of how to look at something for detail inference making. But as you get into the high school years, and sometimes, of course, just like puberty sets in at different levels and different times for kids, it's very similar with, I think, the development of the brain at the same time, where one child will be capable of metaphoric thinking very early on, and another will need much more time to develop that. And I actually think the research is so gratifying on some level because it really isn't necessarily within your control as a teacher to dictate and make sure that everyone gets to the same point at the same time, because there's absolute neurological evidence that that's simply impossible.
Mm-hmm. What you're saying, too, is that, I always, all kidding aside, I'll say, okay, so at the onset of puberty, that's when the prefrontal cortex changes in the brain, and the connections that we use, they get reinforced, and the ones that we don't kind of wither and die. So I always say, puberty can happen anywhere between the ages of 5 and 95, right? So, but all kidding aside,
girls are faster than boys.
Yeah, exactly. And, as 2 middle-aged women, maybe there's some people we know who are still going through puberty in their 50s, but
I thought we were going to talk about politics.
Yeah, exactly. And that's on both sides, too, just to be fair. Anyway, the other thing, too, is that so what happens with the onset of puberty, we also know, too, that girls are usually a year or 2 ahead than the boys are. And it's not like one is better than the other. It's just different. That's just the bottom line. It's just different. The girls are usually 2 years earlier than the boys are. And as far as that development that happens, because it's triggered by puberty, is what the neuroscientists are finding. And I wanted to go back to something that you just said, that when they're still in that kind of concrete phase, that it's a real advantage in developing language and literacy, that there's some concrete things that we can teach at that time. So I'm thinking when kids are like in 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, I was thinking in particular something like text structures. So like how a science article is structured and how it impacts the text, because that's a very concrete, solid thing. And I was wondering if he had some other things that came to mind on that.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I also think that what is taking place because of the hormones has this psychosocial effect as well, which I think that many an experienced middle school teacher will recognize this. There is no structure in the interior of the average hormonally enhanced middle schooler whose body and whose brain and whose spirit and whose sexuality is organizing itself on a fundamental level. And that's why many times they are so grateful for external structures, and not just external disciplinary structures. That's usually what is inferred from that, but actually external textual structures. I find that beginning with the basics of argument and how it works at level is actually very much within the reach of kids, and that they are able to understand the ideas of claims and the ideas of evidence, the ideas of actually warrants when they're needed to link evidence with claims. This is actually the perfect time to introduce that. I think that that's one area I can think of. And the other place I think of when I'm thinking about middle schoolers, I'll never forget when I cut my hair. I was teaching in an all-boys school. I had boys from the age of 13 to 18. I had hair that was about 1.5 feet long. And then I decided to go with a pixie. And I came to school, and 2 of my 13-year-old boys, and this was a very rough school, I might add. This was by no means a cream puff working environment. It was actually a very highly impoverished and really challenging school. But 2 of my 13-year-old boys broke into tears when they saw me because it was something that was so unexpected. And also because they said that I was gone.
Wow. It reminds me of Dr. Sheldon Cooper on Big Bang Theory when Penny cuts her hair and he's like, I don't like it. It's changed. It's different. Going back to argumentation, I just wanted to yes and you on 2 things on that, is that those structures, a great website for our listeners is ThinkCirca, CERCA, stands for Claim, Evidence, Reasoning, Counter-Argument, Audience, and Appropriate Language. Highly recommend that you go check it out. Great resources for using differentiated texts and developing arguments. Highly recommend it. And parents, too, go check that out, too, for your kids and just argumentation. But when we talk about claim and evidence, this is the thing always as a challenge for me as a teacher, and I hear this over and over again, is that the kids will quote dump and they'll evidence dump, but it has nothing to do with their claim, which is where the reasoning comes. And that's so inferential, which, of course, that is one of the areas that I think kids, when they're going through adolescence and these changes in the brain, that's something that they need a lot of experience with in order to create those neurological connections so they can tie evidence together, which is the reasoning. Kids just struggle with that all the time. And I'll say at a professional learning context, and I'll say, hey, so how many of you have students who quote dump, or science teachers who have kids who put data in, but they don't explain how it proves or disproves the thesis? They know they need the evidence. That's the very concrete, right? But as far as what does it mean, they have so much difficulties, a lot of challenges with that inferencing. So what are you to do as a parent of a teenager or as a teacher? You got to model it. You got to keep showing them how to do it over and over and over again so they have models for that, and they have to keep practicing it so then they can develop the independence to do it. So they need a ton of exposure.
And I will say that, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the other key tool, I think, for learning at this age that really has quite a lot to do with literacy, even though it is very much a visual medium that seems to be really focused on spatial reasoning, which is maps, the use of maps. And we'll probably devote an entire podcast to this later, but historical maps, imaginative maps are basically the means through which students, especially at the middle school age and going onward, are able to take that evidence dump and to arrange it and order it and make connections. That is what a physical map is. The other thing about what a map is that a map is always inevitably a metaphoric and partial representation of a whole. Otherwise, of course, it couldn't be the size that it is. Otherwise, it would actually be the size of whatever landscape that it described. Mm-hmm. So again, those kinds of tools, I think, emerging and in the middle school age where you're really taking students through the text, through the facts, and then also demonstrating the reasoning that links the claims and the evidence, whether it's visual evidence or whether it is literary evidence, whether it's factual, data-driven evidence. And all of this is going to reinforce that development of the abstract thinking skills that you need in order to tackle more complex texts at all levels in later adolescence.
Yeah, and I think the MAP activity for social studies teachers, another way to kind of think of it is that kids need tangible, concrete models or artifacts, and it's from there that they can start developing the abstract, right? For instance, maps are interpretation, right? And orientation and inferencing. That's why these hands-on experiences are so critical. I think sometimes we lessen the importance of experiential learning, especially with older kids, but they really need that. They need those experiences in order to develop that kind of metaphorical thinking. And science, they need to do labs and not read about science in a textbook. They need to actually do experiments. They need to get out there and do the classic physics experiment of how can you drop an egg from a one-story window and not make it break, or build a bridge out of toothpicks. I mean, all of those things sometimes are characterized as fluff and stuff, but they're really critical as far as taking the concrete to the more inferential, abstract. And math is another great example, too, because they use manipulatives in order to represent complex ideas. And as you mentioned the maps, I just kept thinking of all these other contexts and disciplines where we do that, right?
As you discuss the math representation and the use of manipulatives, it brings me back to a story that I think is worth telling here about very, very highly intellectually skilled, bilingual, and actually driven towards engineering students that I taught in a class called Maps and Mapping. And at the very beginning of the course, one of the things that we began with was how to make maps and how to find one's direction. And I quickly discovered that most of my students could not read basic maps because, of course, their phones had been doing that for them and finding locations for them. And as anybody who's used their Google app one too many times or their map quest and suddenly realizes that they can no longer find their way down the street, if you don't use it, you lose it. Well, if you've never used it before because you've always had the cell phone in your hand in order to do the work for you, things like this can happen. I asked my students to please measure me a 15-yard length of twine because we were going to use it outside. And I asked a group of young men to measure out 3 lengths of 15 yards of twine. And I gave them a measuring stick, it was a meter stick actually, because we were doing 15 meters of twine. And I said, here you go. And if you could give this for me, you can go outside and figure out how to do it. And time was, that's outside the classroom. So I thought that would be, a couple minutes. And after about 5 minutes, I thought, well, what's happening out there? And then I looked through the window and I saw 2 young men with their cell phones out. And I said, what's going on out there? And they said, well, we're just researching this and how to do it. And we got the formula. And I said, oh, really? And they said, yes, this is what you do. And they explained to me that there was a formula for getting 15 meters of twine, and this was how to do it. And I said, I'm going to show you a different formula. And I took the stick and I started wrapping the twine around it. And they both looked at me and not looking embarrassed at all. They both said, oh.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was not something that I had told them up on. It was something they had never actually experienced.
Yeah, there's more than one way to get to the roof. But, isn't that classic with this generation? It's like we're Googling it and researching how to do it. Which is...
Both of those young men have now finished their undergraduate degrees in engineering.
Yeah, there you go.
15-year-olds were unable to figure out how to measure 15 meters of twine given a stick and a ball of twine.
Yeah, but they know how to research it. We got to give them props on that, right?
They knew all the keywords.
Yeah, they knew all the keywords, right? But this is a really, it kind of goes into the next, topic that we wanted to cover in the podcast, is how critical environment is. So if Deanna had handed out the pre-measured string, that moment wouldn't have happened, right? And realizing that, I think oftentimes one of the things that I hear from colleagues all the time is time. I never have enough time. And it's this 4-letter word, not the 4-letter word I use when I'm driving when I'm in a traffic jam in Chicago, but time is just one of those things. So I want everybody to understand that you'll never have enough time. So everybody needs to just take a deep breath, a namaste moment, and get over it, because you're never going to have enough time. But when kids experience these things, an environment that's dynamic and encourages them to explore and develop independence, that really has an impact on brain development. And Sarah Jane Blakemore, wonderful researcher out of the UK, highly, highly recommend her book, The Learning Brain. And she's also got a fabulous TED Talk. So if you just type her in, it's Sarah, not with an H, so it's Sara Jane, Jayne, Blakemore, and type her into TED Talk. Wonderful 20-minute TED Talk. And one of the things that she talks about is environment. And just like with the little guys with 0 to 12 months and how much environment plays into brain development, this is true with teenagers as well. Just like with babies, with anybody, if you're yelling or they feel threatened, it engages the limbic system, which is our most primitive part of the brain. And the reptilian brain, and that's the fight or flee response. So it's very upsetting to me when I hear kids, even teenagers, being yelled at or told you can't do this, you can't do that, because then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we're engaging the limbic system rather than the prefrontal cortex. So our classrooms really need to resemble those kinds of dynamic places. When we lecture to students all the time, and it's very much teacher-directed, we're not engaging in the frontal cortex. It becomes compliance behavior, which is fight or flee, and that engages the limbic system, I would argue. So it becomes more about compliance when we're in this more of like a lecture kind of environment and talking at kids, and the call and response is dependent on the teacher rather than the students generating it and having these interactions.
I was thinking about what you're talking about with fight or flight being the best known aspects of the limbic system, especially uncovered with a lot of trauma research and theory regarding the third response, which is the freeze response. And especially, as you just described, the lecture classroom, of course you can tell when a student is flying, the flight. Of course you can tell, or you think you can, because they have that faraway look in their eyes. You can also, of course, recognize when there's a fight response, and we actually become conditioned to respond to that more aggressively. But freeze response is a hidden response, a response that makes your student look as though he or she is compliant, and it is actually a survival instinctive mode. And it is disengagement. And disengagement, of course, turns off one's capacity to even absorb information in order to protect one in the present moment. And so as you launch into your, favorite story about Herman Melville and the last time that he accidentally threw away the Moby Dick manuscript, and you see a student nodding and smiling at you, that doesn't mean that they're engaged.
Yeah, that they're engaged and they're processing it. Yeah, absolutely. And these rich environments of text in an environment that embraces the importance of literacy and to play with literacy and experiment with it is really key. And one of the things that I encounter quite a bit in my work with schools is that many colleagues are skeptical when I say, hey, so, when we teach in centers and more student-centered learning at this level from 4th through 12th grade, I hear from upper grade teachers in particular, they'll say, well, I'm going to give them lectures and things like that because that's how college is. Well, college is not like that actually anymore. And I just read, wrong. And it's like the McLaughlin group, right? Wrong. And so for those of you who know that reference, but
I ask you more time.
Yeah, exactly. Deanna Gallagher.
We might say that, oh, well, that happens in the science classroom. Well, actually, my husband's a full professor in physics. And guess what happens when he lectures? Wrong.
Yeah, wrong. And the same thing as a professor in higher education at the university level for over 15 years, same thing. I did not lecture really to a great extent. It was a lot of doing. And of course, the obvious thing is I notice that my students engage more and such. When we do professional learning workshops, when Deanna and I do that, we don't sit there and lecture because we know that we don't learn well. And there's been articles in Journal of Higher Education, Higher Education Chronicle, and I just saw one on EdWeek too about that the lecture needs to die. And because the evidence is really clear from neuroscience.
This is not to discount the beauty and the power of a well-delivered monologue.
Exactly.
This is not to say that, in fact, there is a certain percentage of individuals that actually do learn very effectively that way. I actually can imagine myself in university classrooms and put myself in the place of writing down notes and watching my Irish history professor unfold the story of the Easter Rising and being absolutely captivated by it. Mm-hmm. But guess what? I was very much in the minority.
Yeah, but that's also a performance too, right? So it's a performance, and that's a different stance.
That performance twice a week. Not 6 times a day.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of like want to recap our podcast because we're about to sign off, and we're talking about the changes in the brain during adolescence, the importance of the prefrontal cortex, and that at the onset of puberty, there's that shift to metaphorical thinking and reasoning. So we have to really establish that context for that kind of development to happen. And Deanna brought up the really important point that when kids are still in that concrete phase, that's an opportune time to teach maybe about text structures, vocabularies, Latin roots, grammar structures, things like that, and text structures because they're concrete, right? And then that helps us, once they have that established, moving them into the metaphorical and abstract. And that environment has a huge impact on teenagers, just as it does with 0 to 12 months. And recommend The Learning Brain by Sarah Jane Blakemore. Also, Eric Jensen's Teaching the Teenage Brain is a wonderful text, and one of my favorites is John Medina's book, Brain Rules. I actually have a little bit of an intellectual crush on John Medina, so I don't know if you'd ever listen to this broadcast, but, Brain Rules. Grrr, yeah, so.
Remember that for your next birthday present, huh? Well, yeah. Actually, you brought up Sarah Jane Blakemore, and you spoke so highly of her, and I agree that her work is so common sense, it's revolutionary.
Yes.
So revolutionary, it's common sense. And yet, I would also, even though this is not a paid plug, I do know that she just published her latest work called Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain.
Yeah.
And anything with a story that has a secret life in it, I'm always...
You're going back to your Nancy Drew days. Yeah.
And in any case, I'd be very happy to give that book a plug, not having read it, but knowing that this individual is a fantastic researcher, and who knows, maybe we'll have an opportunity to explore more work with her in the near future.
Yep. So we're encouraging you to subscribe to our podcast, Two Lit Ladies. And also you can find me at KatherineMcKnight.com, where you can find out how to contact us and such. And of course, Deanna and I are always working in schools, working to get achievement up in grades 4 through 12. And we're always eager to get into schools and see teenagers and teachers and work with them to really get that achievement up. So we're going to sign off now. Two Lit Ladies. I'm Katie McKnight, and
I'm Deanna Gallagher, and we are
the Two Lit Ladies. Okay, well, we'll see you at the next podcast. Thanks. Bye.